And here we go. We have liftoff.
Propulsion continues to be normal.
R68 chamber pressure looks good.
Doubling up. Roger, with planet.
Water towers fly! Yes!
Tango down to nominal.
Flight downside FD off. Bring in FD off. It's orange!
R45! Oh my god! Oh my god!
Decollage.
Amazing!
Put that in the big bag, Tingle.
343 unfolds to go.
Indeed.
We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
The methane would be igniting in the flare, correct?
Yikes. You read? We don't need any more of these.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Lon Seidman with NSF, and we are back with Countdown to Launch. This is our semi-regular show where we look at all of the things that are happening around the second attempt to reach orbit with the SpaceX Starship. And what we're going to be doing today and in the future is just looking at all the news items that have popped up over the course of the day, in this case, the day before when we last got together to discuss what is happening. And joining me today, we have Trevor Sesnick. How you doing, Trevor?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to talk about the current status of Starship with y'all.
And we got a lot to talk about. And before we do, though, I want to introduce Ryan Caton. How you doing, Ryan?
How you doing, Ron? It's very warm over this side of the Atlantic. It's a little bit unbearable, but we're going to get through it because Starship, well, maybe might not be launching as soon as we thought it did, but we'll get to that in a minute.
And it's definitely not launching today, so we will definitely get to that. And it's hot everywhere, including in Texas, where the rocket is currently on the pad. And we've got some developments. And the first one, so yesterday we were talking about a tweet from Elon Musk saying that Starship was ready to launch. And then after we went off the air, or the virtual airwaves as they are, Eric Berger posted this tweet about a statement rather from the FAA talking about how SpaceX still needs to meet all the criteria that came out of their mishap investigation that SpaceX had undertaken after the prior launch attempt. So we don't know really what is happening here, whether or not it is the FAA or the FAA and SpaceX working together. My thought on this, and I'll turn it over to you two to offer some more commentary as well, is that I think we're down to what they call the last mile, where all the smaller details, the things that are not quite the low-hanging fruit have to get hashed out, and that might be what we're kind of waiting on here. Perhaps the FAA is looking for some more out of SpaceX, and I think that might have been why Elon tweeted that, perhaps, to maybe get some public pressure on the agency. Trevor, what do you think about this?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Fight, yeah, that's right. We're going to have some disagreements here. Go ahead. That's the fight bill.
Yeah, so first of all, I don't think Elon's claims that the vehicle is completely ready to launch are fully accurate. So just this morning, for example, SpaceX removed the piping from underneath the large horizontal water tanks as part of the water deluge system. We don't have footage of that, sadly, but it's thought that they could be doing that to add a fourth tank before the next launch, or they could just be doing some work on the tanks. Additionally, the CO2 storage tank has been removed, and we have footage of that rolling down the road. And so without these two tanks, they will not be able to fuel the vehicle and have the deluge system work. So from the ground perspective, SpaceX is certainly not quite ready for a launch yet. It's very probable that they could work through these issues extraordinarily quickly and get ready for a launch when the FAA gives their permission. And then on top of that, I would be very surprised if they move directly into a launch attempt. I personally think that they'll probably conduct a full stack cryo test, which they have not done yet. So the vehicle is definitely close to being ready to launch, but I think we're still several weeks out from a technical perspective.
So it could be the rocket itself is ready, but all the other things connecting to it may not be. Ryan, what are your thoughts on all this?
In my opinion, if I was in charge of this, which I'm definitely not qualified to do, but if I were in charge of this, I'd want to send Starship through a full wet dress rehearsal process like we saw with the last stack to make sure that there's, no erroneous data or anything like that. I'd want to send it through the full process. However, I can also understand the perspective of, let's not bother with doing a dedicated wet dress rehearsal, let's just throw it into the first launch attempt. Because the first launch attempt for the first integrated flight test, that became a wet dress rehearsal after they realised that they wouldn't be able to go out with the launch that day. So I would prefer them to go through a wet dress rehearsal dedicated route. However, I can also understand the route of, let's just gun for a launch attempt. If we don't manage the launch on the first time, we still get the data from fueling the vehicle, right? But let's say we get to T-minus 10 minutes and everything looks good. They've saved the time by not having to do a dedicated wet dress rehearsal. And in this perfect world scenario, they've also managed to launch on the first go, which just makes the entire process of launching Booster 9 and Ship 25 much quicker. And then they can move on to working on the next booster and ship, whichever combination that is, which ends up doing Flight Test 3.
And we're going to talk more about that future ship in a few minutes here when we get to our second topic. By the way, if you are watching from home or wherever you might be, definitely leave us some questions in the chat. We can see them better if you tag us with @NASASpaceflight, because this is a live stream, an interactive show, and we're going to be with you for the next hour here. So please submit your questions and commentary, and we will try to get to those questions as we work our way through the topic here. And coming back to this topic of the FAA and who's the one that's holding things up here, we do know that SpaceX did submit their report to the FAA close to a month ago, so that is in hand. And the problem that we have is that there's not a lot of transparency really from either side as to what's in the report, because it's confidential, or what the FAA is going back and forth with SpaceX about. I, for one, would just love to see it all out in the open, and we could then have everything we need here. And when you go back to the statement that Eric Berger got yesterday, a lot of what the FAA said yesterday was what they were saying before that report was submitted. So they're kind of sticking to their messaging. We haven't seen anything really leak out of the government side at all. And we're not seeing anything really leak out of SpaceX other than, I think, maybe Elon insinuating a little bit of frustration that perhaps this process is not going as fast as he would like it to. So we'll keep an eye on this. But right now it looks like at least that water system is out of commission for the moment. And we'll have to see what happens as time goes on here. So I'm going to pull up a question here from Sepe Duluf, who says, let me get the button pushed here. Are we going to see the launch this week? I don't think so, gentlemen. What do you think? We'll start with Trevor.
Definitely not. There's no way they could make a launch attempt this week, in my opinion. And I don't even think they could make one next week at this point. So I think we're at least a week and a half to 2 weeks out, at minimum, probably more than that.
And Ryan, there was a statement that we have here just about the hazardous space operations update that gets sent out to mariners and other people in the area around Texas. It looks like they were targeting September 8th, which is tomorrow, for this original launch, which they have now postponed. Do you have anything more on that?
Well, this is a process which we've gotten a little bit used to. We saw local not Mars notices to mariners published for August 31st and then September 8th. So you can see this kind of knocking it down the road process. We've seen it before. It's nothing new. And to be honest, it's to be expected. And this pulling of those not Mars from the areas for both the launch and the return of Starship, if it gets that far, it's to be expected. It just kind of makes it official, if it were. And, it's also quite obvious by the state of the tank farm, as we were just saying, with the water deluge system, it's not going to be happening anytime soon, unfortunately. But I'd say a couple of weeks, maybe, that might be doable.
Yeah, I have a feeling maybe by the time the month is out here that they'll get all this worked out with the FAA and we'll have a launch license and hopefully the ground systems will be ready to go and we'll go from there. And actually, I wanted to bring this up because, some folks watching haven't been following things as closely as we all have. And Lone Wolf here is asking, what mishap happened with SpaceX? Trevor, this is just kind of a standard procedure when your rocket doesn't do what it's supposed to do, right?
Yeah, so anytime that there's an anomaly, the FAA conducts these mishap investigation reports. And the major item for the first test flight was the FTS on the Falcon, or on, not Falcon, wow, Falcon 9 is in my head, on Starship and on the booster. And what they noticed is even though the autonomous flight termination system, which the way that that system works is as soon as it realizes that the vehicle is outside of some predefined corridor, as soon as the vehicle is outside of that, it detonates the charges both on the booster and on Starship. And those charges successfully fired. However, they did not destroy the vehicle to the extent that SpaceX and the FAA were expecting. So you can actually see that the vehicle remained intact for, I think, 30 to 40 seconds, somewhere in there, after the charges went off, before the entire vehicle blew up. And the FAA was very much not happy with that, because obviously they have a vehicle flying through their airspace in a place that it's not supposed to be. So SpaceX has done a lot of FTS testing. We saw an FTS test out of Massey's, which is thought to be validating the new FTS. And we've seen that on the booster and on the ship, they've added extra charges to ensure vehicle destruction if they need to use the flight termination system again. So that's the primary item that they've been working through. I'm sure there are some other minor ones, but that's the only one that is really public. And then the one other thing that I'll note really quick is this process of SpaceX waiting for the FAA is not really anything new. We saw even with Starhopper, SpaceX said that they were technically ready to launch and that the FAA, they were waiting on the FAA. And then very quickly they worked together to make sure that they were able to launch safely. We saw this with SN8 and later of the suborbital test flights. And then once again, we're seeing this. So this is not unprecedented by any stretch.
And that's it. I mean, there's a negotiation here. I think, government moves a lot slower than sometimes commercial industry does. And that's certainly evident as we've seen throughout the process here. So that's definitely something we'll have to keep an eye on. And again, we just don't know enough here. And even those with really good sources inside of the FAA and in SpaceX to some degree just can't get all the information we're looking for, because both sides in this, FAA and SpaceX, don't want to, hurt their position if they are in a dispute of some kind. So things tend to stay very confidential, and those in the know, unfortunately, can't tell us more. But we're going to keep an eye on this and see where things go with it as time goes on. And certainly we had a statement yesterday that we didn't have, a statement today that we didn't have yesterday. So things are moving in a direction of some kind, but now it looks like they're doing a lot more work on the ground there. And we're going to bring up a local notice to mariners on screen as well, because this also kind of gives us some insight as to what's going on. It's not just the FAA that has to issue things. There's other agencies, Ryan, that also send out notices about a potential launch, right?
Yeah, so, other agencies can't license a launch. That's a bit of a misconception that I've seen being flown around. Even some people think that NASA licenses launches because it's a space mission. They don't. This is all down to the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. They license every launch that happens. So it's only the FAA that can license a launch. However, other organisations, such as maritime organisations that have to keep an eye on the coasts and the seas and the oceans and whatnot, they have to provide notices to mariners, that's why they're called NOTMARs, that things could be happening. Because if they didn't, and someone strayed their boat into a hazard zone, and they were not made aware of it, and something did happen to that boat and the people on board, who would be at fault? It would be the regulatory bodies, which is why these notices exist. But again, they don't license the launch. The maritime bodies can't license the launch. They just have to make everybody else aware in their jurisdiction that a launch could be happening at that time.
And you don't want rocket parts falling on your head, or the full rocket if it doesn't successfully blow up, for sure. And Trevor, one of the other things that we look for beyond these mariner notices are also just notices to the local community around this launch pad, because roads close, right, and other things happen. So if you're in Texas at Boca Chica, what do you receive when they're about to do something?
Yeah, so if you're really close in the village around, they'll issue evacuation notices and just say you cannot be home from this time to this time. And then for the larger area, there'll be those evacuation notices and hazard zones will be posted. And those are just to ensure public safety. You need to stay out of these zones during these specific times when there's a fully loaded vehicle. And then there's also the notice to airmen, which will eventually come, which ensures that there are no aircraft overhead, similar to what the NOMARs do.
And there has to be some coordination here, right? So that's all the things that our NASA spaceflight NSF team looks for when trying to figure out when there's activity. When we have a booster going down the street, we know because the road's going to be closed. We know when there's a lift operation going on. We know when there might be a wet dress rehearsal or even a test of the rocket system at the pad. So there are things that we can look for beyond the FAA to try to figure out what's going on. And sometimes you might see those dates happen in that coordinated fashion before the license is officially announced. And those are all the different signs that we're going to look for. And I would say, if kind of closing out this speculation topic here, Ryan, we're not sure as to what the launch date is going to be, because we're not seeing a lot of hints yet that things are closing and mariners are being notified, right? It just is nothing out there at the moment.
Yeah, the only things we've gotten are the not Mars, the notices to mariners. There's no FAA restrictions in place just yet, and to be honest, I wouldn't expect to see any until we get a launch license. For the first test flight, the first integrated test flight, the launch license was really the thing that kicked everything into a higher gear. You know, everything started to properly slot into place then. The only things we can really try and work out beforehand is going to be things like the not Mars, maybe looking at the WB-57 schedules, which are those really high altitude aircraft with the cameras that were looking at Starship during its ascent to get a different engineering angle on it. So, you know, those are the two things that are really kind of penciled in ahead of time, but they're just penciled in. There's no schedules like that. There's just it's anything along those lines that happens would be way in advance and could be shifted very, very quickly.
So we called that the tea leaves that we read, and I forgot about that aircraft. That's another thing. Can you tell us a little bit more about that high altitude aircraft? That's a NASA plane, right?
Yeah. So they have, I believe they have 2 or 3 aircraft. There's a couple which are currently under maintenance. They only have one that's currently in operation flying, but they haven't been decommissioned. They're just undergoing normal maintenance. And essentially they fly up to 60,000 feet. They've got some very, very high powerful zoom cameras on board that are also stabilized, so they can zoom right in on the vehicle as it flies through the atmosphere. And unlike ground cameras, they'll be able to get a different angle on the vehicle as it flies. Of course, eventually it'll get higher than the aircraft, but for a lot of the time it will be lower than the aircraft. So it just gives engineers a better perspective, or a different perspective rather, of the launch as it's going through. And they can also be equipped with things like thermal imaging and different things like that.
And it's pretty cool. They have I think one of the pilots has a Twitter account, and he often posts some neat stuff from that. So it's definitely worth checking that out. We have a chat here or a question from Musical Wolves, who's speculating. Again, we're just speculating here that a full stack wet dress rehearsal might be required for that FAA launch license, and that's one of the things that's holding things up. Ryan, do you think a wet dress rehearsal is just going to have to happen?
It depends if it's one of the mitigations that the FAA proposes, or rather gives SpaceX. You know, if in the mishap report they're like, we want you to do a full wet dress rehearsal for whatever reason, then SpaceX kind of has to do it in order to obtain a launch license, right? That's just speculation, though. We don't know what's in that yet. But, you know, I wouldn't understand how that would be in relation to the flight termination system not working, which is, you know, kind of the key point. I'm not sure if a wet dress rehearsal could have, you know, changed the outcome of the flight in any way. But yeah, if the FAA wants SpaceX to do a wet dress rehearsal, I'm not really sure they'll have any other option but to do a wet dress rehearsal.
To do one, right? And they have it there. They could certainly fuel it up. Nathaniel Kern here in the chat says, could SpaceX ruffle the FAA's feathers enough to cause them to lose their NASA moon lander contract? I don't think that could happen. You know, what's funny is the government's very big, and NASA and the FAA, although they do a lot of work together, are two separate agencies. So I don't think this would put the contract at risk. But one thing I think could happen is that if there's a stalemate, for example, between SpaceX and the FAA, and it can't get resolved through the types of pressure perhaps that Elon's trying to put on the agency right now, I could see somebody in the administration saying, hey, you know what, we're trying to get to the moon here, and maybe we should all sit down and try to figure out a way that we can get SpaceX into compliance here so we can move forward with this test. Because, Trevor, you know, Artemis 3 requires a functioning Starship program in order to get to the moon, and that requires a lot of Starship launches to fuel everything. You know, does this hold up the entire Artemis program if we're still getting caught up in these FAA license issues?
So I think an important thing to remember is the FAA kind of has two jobs. The first is to help support spaceflight or aerospace in the United States, and the second is to keep the public safe. And these two goals that are laid out for them are kind of hard to do at the same time, because for one of them, you obviously want to make sure that you're keeping people safe and making sure that these organizations are following all of the rules and regulations. But on the other hand, skipping some of the rules and regulations would help speed things up. So the FAA is always put in this very hard point where they have to balance making sure that they're not putting the public at risk and making sure that these companies are able to innovate quickly. So in my opinion, the FAA is doing the right thing here. SpaceX got lucky that on the first flight test that the vehicle was safely over the ocean when they lost control of it. And it's good that the FAA is making sure that such a thing will not happen again. And that's the FAA's job. So I think the FAA wants Starship to launch, but they want it to launch safely. And same thing with NASA and the Department of Defense and others. So I don't think it's going to be that big of a problem. And I definitely don't think that the FAA could prevent SpaceX from fulfilling the HLS contract.
And I have another comment here that came in via PebMets. Thank you for the $20 super chat for your support of the effort here. Who says, I can't see Starship flying until the end of the year. I would assume the U.S. Fish and Wildlife is sharing their concerns from the last launch. When the FAA report is completed, SpaceX would need to implement changes. And that's a whole nother issue, because there are environmental groups who claim that the FAA wasn't doing enough to support the local environment in the area around the Starbase, and they actually accused the FAA of being in cahoots with SpaceX to push things along and look the other way on environmental concerns, and that lawsuit is still active. I don't think it's going to hold things up necessarily for this launch, but that's another dynamic here with all the regulatory things going on with this program. So it's just very complicated, and unfortunately, we don't have, again, a window into exactly what the position of each player is in this and how it all impacts everybody here. Before we move on, though, I do want to acknowledge some folks, because we do have a bunch of supporters here on the stream. So we have Egg3VTech, as a new member. Thank you for becoming a PadRat member. Gamicon also became a new PadRat member. Jim Cavett gifted a Red Team membership. Thank you very much for that. One of the things I like to talk about when we're doing these streams is that if you're not a member of NSF, if you stay in the chat long enough, usually a generous benefactor comes along and gifts you one. And if you do get gifted a membership, please thank the person who's contributing that. Jim also did a second one here, so thank you very much for that. The Texas Bandit became a Capcom member. Jack Gibson became a PadRat member, along with PJC Zuba. And Tracy gifted 5 Red Team memberships. Thank you very much for your support. So good stuff. Anything else on this topic while we try to flesh out when launch might occur, gentlemen? Anything you want to add?
I think the only thing that can be confirmed is that whilst there's no pipes for the water deluge system, it's not happening. So it's probably not tomorrow. Beyond that, speculate as much as you want on the internet, all right? Because we don't really know. It's not today, it's not tomorrow. That's pretty much all that's confirmed.
And speaking of the water pipes, Trevor, I'm just surprised and amazed, to be honest with you, how quickly they not only rebuilt that launch facility, but added significantly more extensive infrastructure, namely that water deluge system, but I'm sure a lot of other things. SpaceX has demonstrated that even when they do something as big as removing pipes to carry all that water, they can probably put them back in pretty quickly. What do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. It is honestly remarkable how quickly SpaceX has bounced back from the first launch attempt in general, from having significant pad damage to having a fully upgraded pad and fully upgraded booster that will hopefully perform a successful flight. And to your point, yeah, I mean, these are the kind of things that SpaceX is not going to wait around for. If they're able to upgrade the system now while they have a few days down, the SpaceX way is to upgrade that system now. And I'm sure that if they got launch approval, say tonight, which again is not expected at all, they would be able to install those pipes within the next few days for a launch attempt, end of next week, early week after.
And not only did they completely reconstruct the pad, the rocket on the pad is totally new also. It's funny, I think for members of the public who don't maybe follow this as closely as we do, they see kind of a similar image to what they saw a few months ago with the first attempt. But pretty much everything they're looking at was constructed, including the rocket, from scratch from the prior attempt. And it's amazing just how quickly they have been able to turn those things around. So we'll keep an eye on this topic. There is obviously going to be a lot more in the development stage on this. And as things develop, we will be back with this show to let you all know about that. Should we move on to our next topic, everybody? Because there's some more going on at Starbase, isn't there?
That there is.
And that is Ship 26 rolling out. So the Starship that's on top of the booster right now is Ship 25. And we're keeping a close eye on Starbase today because Ship 26, the next one in the lineage, is rolling out to the test stand. So maybe, Ryan, you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yep, so earlier today, if you're watching on Starbase Live, and if you weren't, why were you not? If you want to see everything that's happening 24/7, that's the place to be. So we saw it leave the production site, roll down Highway 4, an extremely similar process, pretty much identical to what we saw with Ship 25, except the SPMT didn't break down. They're actually towing a spare part for the SPMT behind the parade, if you will, as it rolled down Highway 4, just in case
and the
it broke down again.
The SMNT, for people that don't know, is what?
It's the self-propelled modular transporter. It's the basically you see two little car-looking things that sit under the transport stand. So you have two like this, and a transport stand that sits on top in the middle. Those are the two in the name, self-propelled modular transporters. They're transporters that are modular and they can propel themselves down the road. So that's what they use to carry the ship to the launch site. So we saw Ship 26.
Now they're towing their spare parts with them, so in case it breaks down again, they don't have to go back and get it, right?
Yeah, they were just towing them with a normal truck. They didn't have they didn't have an SPMT or an SPMT or anything like that. But the Ship 26 has now made its way to near the, I believe it's suborbital pad B, which is the only stands they have currently, and they're called suborbital pad A and B. They're just used as test stands nowadays. They don't do suborbital flights. But pad B, I believe, is the only pad available at the launch site for ships to do static flights on. So fingers crossed, whilst we're live here, we'll be able to see the ship get lifted as it's been hooked up to the crane as well between the rollout and now. So fingers crossed that happens whilst we're live in a few minutes here. We don't really have a time for that, I don't believe, but you know, would be convenient timing if it happened now.
Well, I do know people from SpaceX watch us, so maybe if they're watching now, maybe if you can just do something
to get
lift
it up.
Yeah, lift it up. And we're going to do some replay here from Starbase Live from a little bit earlier as it was rolling out. And Ryan, this lifting procedure is different for the test stand than it is for what we saw on the lifting the other day when they stacked the Starship onto the booster. So this is just a plain old crane they're using, right?
Yeah, so I believe it's been affectionately nicknamed the Squid. So what you can see when it rolls onto the crane, they have the normal line from the crane that you'd expect, but then they have this little squid-looking thing, which they then attach to ship lift points, which are, I believe, they're 6 points, which are attached around the nose cone of the ship. And what these are for is so they can get a nice, even load on the crane to lift the ship up without having to use the chopstick arms, which are of course only available on the launch tower. And now these lifting points are things we often say when they're removed, because they, on one side of the ship anyway, they get in the way of the thermal protection tiles. So that's one of the things we look for when they're putting the final tiles on the ship to roll it out to the pad for launch. And I believe a little while ago we saw like a fake chopstick lifting jig. So essentially it was like a big frame and it had little stubs coming out to kind of represent what the chopstick does to the ship. But it was like a jig that they could hook onto the ship and just lift with a normal crane. I don't think we've seen that for a little while. I'm not sure if that was mothballed or if they're just not using that anymore. Trevor, I don't know if you have any more information on that. But for the moment, to lift the ships by themselves whilst on the ground, they just use this little squid thing to lift it up with a normal crane.
Yeah, I'm not sure what they've done with that. Sorry.
But it seems like the simplest way to do it, right? If you've got a crane and you know how to lift stuff with a crane, this is, just another big thing to lift. It's a really big thing, but that's what they're going to do. And so, Ryan, when they do this lifting, it's as simple as lifting it up onto that test stand and lowering it, and then it's supported by its own weight. Is that pretty much what they do?
I believe that's pretty much the process that there is. It's not, the orbital launch mount that we're all so accustomed to nowadays. It's a very big, beefy structure. They didn't have that in the early days, just for the suborbital hops that they did with the ships. So it's just lowered down, and I believe it's pretty much just got a connection interface for the ship, so they can load prop onto it, and then it's empty below it, so they can use it for static fires. And they also have, as I mentioned before, they have suborbital pad A. I don't believe that can be used for static fires because they have other testing apparatus on there for cryo-proof testing and things along those lines.
And Trevor, when they do get it on that test stand, how do you keep the rocket from flying away when you light up all those engines? We see the power that gets unleashed with that. What's the secret sauce to keeping your rocket in one place?
Yeah, so there are launch clamps, and I think on the suborbital stands now, I believe they're basically just bolted down since they're not conducting any flight tests. At least I know for sure the QD is just bolted in now, right, for the suborbital flight tests. There was no quick disconnect, or there was quick disconnect, sorry, where as soon as they were lifting off, they were able to pull the QD away. And now they just bolt it straight to the vehicle since they're just doing static fires. And then, yeah, so unlike on the orbital launch mat, right, you have this like really complex set of pins that slide into the booster, the launch clamps. On the suborbital pads, it's just bolted down now.
So just a plain old bolt down and you're good. But I guess on the actual launch pad, you have to have those pins release all at the same time properly, because the rocket is held down until everything is lit up and operating to the point where they can safely release it. So it's got to be a pretty complex system to design your orbital pad around this, right?
Yeah, so this is actually an interesting note on the first flight of Starship, and we suspect that it's going to be the same thing again, where for some reason the launch clamps deployed from the base of the booster it was like 20 or 40 minutes before flight, and so that it was just sitting on the launch clamps. And then as soon as the thrust to weight ratio, as they started igniting engines, as soon as the thrust to weight ratio exceeded 1, the booster lifted off the pad. There was no launch clamps that were deployed during the liftoff sequence, which is very different from how most other rockets work. So it's expected that this is going to change in the future when SpaceX is into like more commercial flights, where they will want to make sure that the vehicle is operating nominally. But all indications so far point to the launch clamps being released at roughly 20 to 40 minutes before launch again.
And I had a question here from the chat from Daniel Weilert. I'm seeing this from a bunch of other folks now also in the chat. Any speculation as to why we don't see any flaps on this rocket?
Oh, that's a good point. I think I don't know this to be true. Obviously, this is just my personal opinion. I think there is probably a chance that SpaceX just wanted to use Ship 26 and rest in peace Ship 27 as kind of glorified nose cones. So, you know, if they don't plan to recover them in any way, what's the point of spending all the money, energy, resources on putting flaps and tiles on it? You know, why don't we just make 2 dumb starships, use them as glorified nose cones for the booster, and then just launch it like that? Ship 27, however, has been scrapped, so it's just Ship 26 of those twins, which currently remains and which we see now at the launch site.
So we might see this kind of as a booster testing article in the future.
Yeah, it just depends. SpaceX may not be expecting the ships to be able to safely re-enter or make it to entry interface just yet. So if they're not expecting a ship with flaps and tiles to make it to entry interface, what's the point of putting flaps and tiles on it, which are the things that allow it to re-enter? So, you know, just try and save on, I assume, to save on research and development costs and time, just to try and shove it on top of a booster and send it as quick as possible.
And you know what they can do with all those savings, guys? They can head to shop.nasaspaceflight.com and buy some patches and a bunch of other cool merch that we've got loaded up in the store for all of you. So we have these brand new Orbital Flight Test 2 patches, very high quality. They're fully embroidered, designed by our own Pauline, and they look spectacular. As I mentioned yesterday, if you were an astronaut going to space, like this is the quality they would slap on your uniform, not any of those like knockoffs that you see. We also have a bunch of other merchandise you can find this patch on, including things like throw pillows and coffee mugs and t-shirts and a whole bunch of other stuff. So we've got some really cool new stuff in the store to commemorate this monumental launch that will happen at some point, and it may happen pretty soon. So that's why we're doing this show. And I think if you are a fan of this development of Starship and our future as a species getting off this rock finally, definitely check out those things in the store. And what's great about these things is as you're walking around with your patch on your hat or on your t-shirt or whatever, people might ask you, and it's a great way to start up a conversation and get more of the general public interested in the space program. We also have these great metallic prints, and we've been really turning stuff around pretty quickly. We've got some shots that we took just the other day that you can now get as a beautiful metallic print that you can hang up on the wall or hang up anywhere for that matter. Look at the detail that you'll get on this. And this is all from our positions outside of Starbase here that we were able to get these photos for. And one of the things that I've been suggesting people do, because I'm doing this myself, is that the holidays are coming up. If you want to give a good hint to somebody, just put that shop.nasaspaceflight.com on your computer of your loved ones, on their computers. And so when they're on there looking like, oh, why is this on my computer? Oh, I know what I can get. I know what I can get Lon for his birthday, which is coming up. So great stuff there, and check it out at shop.nasaspaceflight.com, especially with all that money they're saving down at Starbase. A great way to get some cool stuff going on there. We've got some more folks to thank in the chat. Blushy Boy gifted 1 Red Team membership. I'm squinting because my eyes are failing me at my advanced age here. Rod Tolosa really liked the new format. Awesome. We're glad you liked the show, and thanks for the welcome, and I appreciate your kind words. Yeah, we're experimenting with different types of content because we know there's a lot of interest in this topic, and every small development is significant. So we want to get everybody together to talk about it. So it's great to see so much activity in the chat, and we appreciate your support of all the efforts that we do. And actually, when you look at all this footage from Starbase, these are NSF cameras there. This is not SpaceX cameras. So there's a lot that goes into the production here. We've got to have people monitoring those cameras 24/7 because they don't sleep over there at Starbase. And we also have people out there all the time like Jack, who tries to keep an eye on what's going on the ground, and many others. And you can see just from the live footage just how thick the atmosphere is today. It is hot there. It's hot everywhere from everybody on the chat today, but it's really hot down there. I know Ryan's cooking in across the pond there. Swen Ness, I'm messing up everybody's name here. Swen Nassaro gifted 1 Red Team membership, so thank you very much for that. And actually, it looks like you did 2 of those, so thank you for your support. Super Steph gifted 5 Red Team memberships, and again, if you got one of those Red Team memberships, definitely thank your benefactor there. Andrew Rowe also with 5 Red Team memberships, so good stuff there. Here's a question related to our current topic from Musical Wolves, one of our regulars in the chat room here. How many ship transport stands does SpaceX have? How many rockets could they move at once if they wanted to?
I don't know a definitive answer, but I think it'll probably be, I'd say probably roughly 10 or under, because they don't have to move so many things at once. They also have stands that they sometimes just leave ships and boosters on whilst they're working on them. So it kind of depends what your definition of it is and how many things they need to move at once. But they definitely don't move more than 1 vehicle at once. Unless, I assume they're moving some part of, say, Ship 32 whilst it's being worked on at the production site whilst they're rolling a booster to the launch site, They're not launching... so far, we haven't seen, 3 starships on the highway rolling down with each other to the launch site.
And we do know they're cranking these things out constantly, right? So we've got these 2 that are visible. There's more getting constructed somewhere else, Trevor, or somewhere on site?
Yeah. So I think we've seen parts for ships well into the SN30s, and we have 26 that's already at the launch pad, as we see on our screen right now. 28 is undergoing final assembly, and they're, I think, just into engine installation, if I remember correctly. Or they could be finished with engine installation and working on the heat shielding and stuff, and some of the retrofits. And then I think there are like 3 other starships that are in some in different stages of production. So they have a lot of ships going forward.
And what's the secret sauce here to building rockets so quickly? Because we saw how long the Artemis development was for SLS. Is it just that these are like the minimally viable product? Like how are they able to just construct so many of these large rockets so quickly?
Yes.
We're on what, 28 now? So
Yeah, so it's just a very, very different engineering philosophy where with SLS, the way that it's funded and the way that it's built, it had to work first try perfectly. And because of that, it took longer to design and longer for them to go through all of the testing to make sure that it would work on the first flight. With Starship, SpaceX doesn't care. So what they're able to do is just be like, let's build these, let's fly them, let's blow them up, let's learn from them, and make improvements for the next one. So as part of that philosophy, they just are able to build significantly more ships. And we saw this throughout the suborbital flight tests where they, had many ships lined up to continue doing these belly flop tests. And then now we're seeing it that they're into full-scale testing.
And I'm getting some questions here in the chat, and I've got one coming up on screen right now from Luca Babnik about the HLS. I believe that stands for the Human Lander System, if my acronyms are correct here. And Ryan, that is ultimately the Starship that will launch from Earth and land astronauts on the moon on Artemis 3. And Luca's question here is, do we know how strict the design is of the contract? Could SpaceX modify the design to have multiple stages? Like, is this thing set in stone, or is it also in active development?
We are not expecting Starship to grow a third stage. What we are expecting, though, is the HLS, the Human Landing System vehicle, to be launched into low Earth orbit and have multiple tanker resupply missions taken up to it. So imagine you are on a long drive down the motorway, but instead of having to stop for petrol, your petrol station comes with you, or your petrol station leaves and catches up to you and fills you up whilst you're driving down the motorway. That's essentially how the HLS system is intended to work. The HLS Starship will be orbiting around the Earth, and several different tanker missions will fly up to the vehicle, refill it, put more methane and oxygen into the HLS Starship before it goes on its way to the moon to make sure it's filled up. It has all the propellant that it needs to get there. I don't think we're expecting a third stage, because that'd just be another thing they have to recover. The Starship's cheap, because Starship's intended to be cheap because it's intended to be fully reusable, right? So the more complexity you add, the more difficult that becomes, and the more expensive the entire thing becomes.
And this kind of comes back to our earlier topic, and this is a question from Jelmer Beats, and I'll toss this one over to Trevor, but Ryan, certainly feel free to pipe in on this too. When are they going to assemble the lunar edition of this? Because they obviously need to build this lunar lander, which is going to be different than your typical Starship. There is, I believe, some prototype that they've been painting out at Starbase there, Trevor. So what's going on with that?
Yeah,
and is this FAA thing holding it up?
Yeah, so we've seen a little bit of work being done in Boca Chica for the HLS Starship. As you said, there's been a nose cone that Jack Beyer, one of our photographers, spotted, and it had labels on it that suggested that it was for HLS. Then on top of that, there was we know that there's been testing going on in Los Angeles area near SpaceX's headquarters with elevator testing, and that was several years ago, I think, at this point. So they're obviously making progress, but right now the most important thing for the Starship program is to get through first stage burn, make sure you don't destroy your pad, and then once you have that figured out, you can start working through the second stage burn and there's the HLS nose cone, and start working on HLS more and the other Starship variants. So there's definitely work being done to it, but I don't think we're going to see any of that in Boca Chica for a long time, because they're focused more on full stack testing.
Right,
Yeah,
so you have to get to orbit first, right?
Yeah.
I'd also like to add that we have cameras trained on Starbase. We have cameras trained on McGregor, which is the engine test site, right? But those aren't the only two places where Starship development happens. They work on research and development in Hawthorne, California, within SpaceX's HQ. You're never going to be able to see inside of there. They work on Starship components such as the heat shield tiles at, I believe it's Sidco Road at Cape Canaveral. They work on this vehicle on multiple sites throughout the country. It's not just Starbase. So if you don't see something at Starbase, it doesn't necessarily mean SpaceX isn't working on it. They could just be working on it somewhere else.
And we're at Starbase because we've got cameras on public property outside of the Starbase, but everything there is so big, it's very easy to get great imagery of it. And for some reason, I don't know why, but they won't let us put cameras inside of their other facilities. Like, why not? We're pretty trustworthy. I think people would love to see what's going on inside that building, right?
Might be a violation there of some privacy protocol that they have.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if
probably
they'll appreciate a 24/7 camera outside of mission control.
Yeah, we got those ITAR regulations also.
Yeah.
It's more red tape, but it's all red tape. They just let us do it anyhow because people want to see it. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. And we do have a shot right now. What are we looking at on screen here? This is the prototype mock-up of part of that HLS.
I think it's basically a repurposed test nose cone that was originally going to go to a ship, but it didn't end up doing it. So they've essentially chopped a hole in the side, a door-ish. And we've seen that it says HLS on the side somewhere, just, scribbled on, as in basically a designation of what it is. So that's all of the information we have on it. But it would make sense for them to begin testing, considering Artemis, the test flight of this vehicle ahead of Artemis 3 should be happening soon. And this is Ship 22's nose cone that's been repurposed.
And I guess the other side, we can't see this, but they painted the other side white just recently, right?
Mm-hmm. And that would also go towards what we've seen in renders of things.
So we got cameras everywhere, so there's the other side of it. It looks a lot like what it'll look like, right? So that's pretty cool. Mm-hmm. And somebody on the chat yesterday suggested that this might be Elon's apartment, and I thought it would work well as an Airbnb. I think you could do pretty well with that on there. Hey, we got another supporter here, Super Stoneman 777 with a $15 super chat. Thank you very much for your support. And the support everybody gives is how we bring this coverage to you, because as I mentioned earlier, it's a lot that goes into covering all these different things throughout the world that we cover here. We also have some store messages here. So Anonymous picked up one of those patches, and they're going to slap it on their Space Force uniform. Awesome. Yeah, they look good. I mean, I think you could totally get away with that. I'm sure it's up to regulation and all that good stuff. More red tape. Stephen got one too. Hunter wanted it for his school bag, so you'll be coming to school in style with that patch on there. And Cam is building out his man cave thanks to the hard work and views. Thank you for watching it. We appreciate all of the support there. So here's a good question that I thought we could pick up here, because this is kind of related to our first topic, but also to the second one to a degree. Mercury is wondering, if they built this program outside the USA, would they still have to deal with the FAA? And I may be incorrect, but I'm pretty sure there's a international treaty that most of the countries that are launching things into space have signed back in the 60s. And that treaty basically makes the host country responsible for any damage that rockets from an entity from that country launch anywhere. So if SpaceX launched something from another country and it crashed into a third country, the U.S. would be responsible for, rectifying that situation. So yeah, I think if an American company is making rockets out of the borders of that country somewhere else, the FAA would still have a say in things, along with whatever local agency is there. Am I right about that?
Yeah, and we see this with Rocket Lab, where they're an American company that launches out in New Zealand, yet they still have to deal with the FAA. And not to mention, I think even if SpaceX wasn't an American company, my understanding is that most other companies make their regulations some equivalent to what the FAA does. So the FAA is kind of the leader, and then everyone else adapts that.
Mm-hmm. And also, rest in peace, Virgin Orbit, when they flew out of Cornwall, we saw that the FAA gave them a license to launch, but the Civil Aviation Authority, which is the equivalent to the FAA in the UK, also had to license that launch to happen. They also had to license the spaceport Cornwall, because that wasn't anything to do with the US. That was obviously on British territory in Cornwall. But there's also, for international launches, there is collaboration. Say, for example, if they flew through Irish airspace, they collaborate with Ireland. If they flew through Spanish airspace, Portuguese airspace, if they're flying through people's airspace, they will, throughout NOTAMs, they will collaborate to make sure that everything is as safe as possible. Because if you don't collaborate, then you could end up in a situation where you're launching a rocket into someone else's airspace. But if they weren't aware, that's not going to end well politically for anybody. So, collaboration is key for a worldwide space economy.
And this might be a good recruiting tagline for the FAA. You can see the world with the FAA. I bet you there's probably a few FAA employees out in New Zealand, making sure those Rocket Lab rockets are properly prepared for launch. There is a page on the FAA's website, which we did not have prepared for the chat today, but maybe we can put it into the description later, where they do keep a running tally of all the commercial launches. If you do a Google search for FAA commercial space, you'll see that. And there's quite a bit of activity both here in the US and throughout the world. And even some of the test flights that don't make it to orbit that you don't hear about do have to go through the licensing procedure when they're throwing stuff into the air, either through rockets or some of the other things that we're seeing there. So we do have about 7 or 8 minutes left, but maybe we could do some more speculation about what's going to come in the next couple of days. And Josh King here with a chat. Here's one. How likely is it that S-25 makes it to orbit? A percentage. This might be a good fight bell, because I'm sure we'll have some disagreements of opinion on this one. So why don't we start with Trevor?
I personally think around 60% chance, maybe a little less, maybe closer to 50-50.
I'm going to play Mr. Pedantic here and say 0% chance, because it's not going to do a complete orbit around the Earth. It's going to re-enter the atmosphere near Hawaii before it has the chance to do a complete orbit, which is why I'm going to say 0%.
But you still have it getting into some kind of...
I think that if the booster does its job properly and it gets through hot staging and the ship gets on its way, I think there's a 30% chance it gets to entry interface.
Ryan, I'll then out pedantic you and say, well, it still is in orbit, just has a negative perigee.
There you go.
So there's a 100% chance it will get to orbit right now.
Yeah.
Right. And I would say, look, I'm kind of the more of the layman on the call here. I have a good feeling that it's going to get further than the last one. And I think it all comes down to how many of those engines stay lit on the way up. And that's going to be a big telltale sign as to whether or not we've made any kind of progress here. And Trevor, when we were watching this the other day with that, they did their test on the stand there. They did have a number of engine failures, even at 50%. What do you think was the cause of that? And should we expect engine failures at liftoff like we did last time, or maybe less because the pad is going to be a little less likely to crumble?
Sure. So first of all, I wouldn't call them engine failures during the static fire. I think there was more premature shutdowns, because it's not like we saw the engine explode or anything. It was just detected some data that it wasn't happy with and safely shut down the engine.
I guess if it blew up, they probably would have taken it off, right? So,
yeah.
So the engines are likely still good.
Yes, I think a good sign that the engines are perfectly fine is that they didn't remove them at all. So as to what went wrong, and it sounds like we have the chopsticks opening on booster. Or on the ship, sorry.
So we've got some breaking news down there. Let's see.
Yeah, there you go. You can see them starting to open. So now the full stack is standing on its own.
Wow. That's pretty significant. Because this is the first time we've seen the chopsticks move. I'm just looking at the screen here while we chat. This is the first time we've seen the chopsticks actually move since they put it in place.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what they've been doing. It's not rare for them to keep the chopsticks close to the ship, while they make sure that alignment is good, make sure just everything on the stack looks good, so that they have some secondary support.
All right, so we'll keep an eye on that and see how it goes. And one of the things that came up during our coverage of the stacking was that, and Jack was on the ground there who heard this, that when they released some of the pressure that they were using to hold everything up, there was a pretty sizable clunk, and there was also a bit of a wobble. Ryan, this is, with the new hot staging ring, I guess it latches together a lot differently than it did before, right? So maybe this is something we should expect in the future, to see a little wobble and a little clunk, and clearly it's holding up itself right now without falling over, so that's a good sign. What do you think?
I don't think they've really changed anything on the underside of the ship, so I would assume that the top of the hot staging ring pretty much mirrors as close as possible what was on top of the booster, where before the hot staging ring was a concept that we knew of. There's
we're hearing some audio too, right?
Yeah, so we might hear some igniter tests soon. Yeah.
And what are the igniters? I'm assuming that's what ignites the engines. Am I right about that?
Yeah. So back to the kind of clunking sound that we heard Was it yesterday or 2 days ago? My entire perception of time has gone out the window with this flight test.
We haven't slept since this has started, right?
There's something that you don't really get to feel or see when you're watching from home, and that's the scale. That's the point that this thing kind of feels like it's alive. When the chopsticks move, you hear them clunking, you hear them moving. They're big bits of mechanical infrastructure, so you shouldn't expect this to be silent and rock solid. If this was rock solid, it would be brittle. It wouldn't work. So you've got to expect some movement here, just so it all sticks together properly.
All right, well, we'll keep an eye on that, and we'll go into one last round of speculation with the time we have left here. And Trevor, Booster 26, it's kind of weird that it's out there, right? Like, are they going to test this thing while the other one's on the pad? Are they just trying to kill time before they get the license? What do you think's going on with this?
Yeah, Ship 26 got rolled out earlier today, and it's very unclear what they're doing with it. The previous thought was that SpaceX was going to move past this ship and instead launch Ship 28 with Booster 10 next. However, it seems like maybe that's not the case. And Alex and I were talking earlier, and his speculation, which I mostly agree with, is that they're probably just going to get the ship ready so that if this test flight doesn't go as well as they want it to, they can use it for Booster 10's test flight. And just have a ship that if they lose, they don't matter, when Ship 28 has significantly more upgrades and more work done to it, so they want to be able to test that ship. I've seen a bunch of questions in chat about if they're going to do some flight with it and off of the suborbital stand, and the answer is no, because as we said earlier, they are not able to fly off of the suborbital pads now because they removed the quick disconnects and because they removed the launch clamps. And then other people have speculated that maybe they'll be doing some FTS testing, which also seems very unlikely to me, as the FTS test would almost certainly be done at Massey's. I don't think they would want to risk a full stack just for some FTS tests. So hopefully that's a good quick roundup of what we think is going on.
So and clearly with that crane in place there, the Ship 26 is definitely going to get lifted onto that test stand in a little bit. And we're actually keeping an eye on two things for those of you tuning in. So what we're looking at live from our cameras out down there at Starbase in Texas is Ship 26. This is all happening while we were doing the show, and we love when this happens. So we are going to go into some extra innings here, if you will, as we keep an eye on things. That's a baseball thing for you guys. And what we're looking at is right now Ship 26 with a crane attached to it. We expect that at some point to get lifted onto its test stand. Additionally, we just saw, and this was not something we expected to see today, some chopsticks movement at the orbital pad where we've got Ship 25 on top of Booster 9, I believe. So that's the first time we have seen the chopsticks, which basically hold the structure in place for stacking, move away. And we did not see that at all during the actual stacking. So right now, on the orbital pad, that full stack is basically balanced and is holding up its own weight. Certainly they have it clamped down at the bottom there, but it looks like they've felt confident enough to make sure it could stand up in time for launch, because you can't have those chopsticks in the way when you launch off the rocket there.
And I'm looking really closely. I believe the ship quick disconnect is also fully connected up to the ship now. We saw, I believe, some testing with that the other night, Monday, Tuesday afternoon, evening time-ish. I think we saw some retraction tests of that with the new kind of taller structure. They've had to shift it up the height of one ring because they've added the hot stage ring in between the ship and the booster. Right. So I believe that's hooked up right now, and that's not really going to do a good job of keeping the ship in place if it decides to fall over. So that's to give it, that's to basically give it power, give it fuel, give it oxygen. That's what the point of that disconnect is, and obviously to disconnect quickly when launch time comes.
Right, and so that's a pretty big milestone, right? To start seeing some of those umbilicals getting attached, right? So that clearly they're anticipating something happening soon, and certainly this rocket would not be sitting on the pad. Back to our earlier speculation, this would not be sitting on the pad if they didn't think a license would be coming at some point in the very near future. So big milestone here to see those chopsticks moving away. They do keep them in pretty close.
And
Ryan or
their chopsticks are opening more. Sorry to interrupt.
They are. That's okay. No, I have a very tiny window on my tiny screen here with my failing eyesight, so I appreciate it. And how quickly, if something were to happen, can they get those chopsticks back in place?
Not super quickly. It takes a while to line up. You can kind of see the pins that go into the ship near the top of the chopsticks, I believe. But yeah, it's not a super quick process. So
Yeah.
And I know we've talked about this before, but for those who haven't seen this before, this rocket really is at the moment kind of balanced on its own, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's no other
just
way
the
it can
launch
stand
tanks.
without the chopstick.
Right. I mean, it is bolted down at the bottom, but those bolts probably couldn't support the weight if it were to tip in one direction or the other.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
can definitely take some torque on them, given that, there's a ton of force that it'll need to hold down during launch. But obviously, you don't want to have too large of a torque on at the base of the vehicle, especially when at most you have 120 meter long lever acting on those.
Right. And we're seeing more movement there, so they're opening up wider. They don't move very quick, do they? So it might be hard to see the movement, but in keeping an eye on this throughout the course of today's stream here, it's moving.
Yeah, when we put this in videos, we tend to speed it up a little bit. So if you're used to it going faster, that's because we speed up the footage usually, because it takes a little while, and the videos would be got a lot longer if we played the chopsticks back in real-time speed.
And Chris B, who's one of our team members, obviously a big fan of the space shuttle program as I was and am. And I recall seeing the RSS, the rotating service structure, moving at about that same speed. They would invite us out to the pad to watch the process. It took quite a while, and it almost didn't look like it was moving until you played it back on your video and kind of scrubbed through it there. So now let me ask you guys this. Could this mean that we might be seeing a wet dress rehearsal, perhaps, that they're getting things into kind of a launch type position as they perhaps wait, or maybe the FAA has kind of said, hey, you got to do the wet dress rehearsal here?
It's an interesting point, Trevor. I don't know if you have anything to add, but this is the chopstick configuration we saw with IFT-1's wet dress rehearsal, but that's kind of pretty much all there is to say, at least that I know of with this.
Yeah, I'll just note that Alex, our resident Starship expert in our back channel, saying speculation from me. Normally when they move the chopsticks like this, when in countdown and preparing to get filled with propellant ahead of launch, but it may also happen if they plan a cryo test or wet dress rehearsal. So maybe SpaceX is thinking of doing a cryo or WDR this Sunday. So I kind of mostly agree with what Alex is saying there, that especially if they truly are just waiting for the FAA, which again, we have reasons to believe that's not quite the case, they may as well just do some full stack testing. And I think a wet dress rehearsal would increase the chance that they're able to launch on the first launch attempt. And if not, just a full stack cryo test would greatly help those odds as well.
And Ryan, what kind of risk is there with this rocket standing fully stacked at the pad for a long period of time? I mean, clearly, if you have a high wind event or something, that's an issue. But I would imagine it's probably not good to keep this thing like this for too long before launching, right?
They've kept stacked vehicles up there for a fair while before, probably a few weeks at a time. It really the point, they wouldn't want to have the vehicles stacked there for too long. Probably just because it means they're not launching. And with the last stack, Elon said in Twitter Spaces, I forgot if it was said before or after, but he definitely said something along the lines of part of the reason they wanted to launch Booster 7 and Ship 24 is because they were older generations of vehicles and they didn't want to have to keep storing them. They kind of just wanted to get them out of the way, and by launching them, they managed to get that done at the same time as collecting a bunch of flight data, So that's kind of that is a mindset they have. Yeah, it's a mindset that does exist within SpaceX, definitely. So that's probably the key reason why they wouldn't want to have a ship stacked on top of a booster for so long, is because it's in the way of future development.
And Trevor, while we're providing some live commentary as we're winding down this show and watching what's going on down there, our cameras are tuned to this all the time, right? So people can just watch whenever?
Absolutely. So if you go to nsf.live, you'll see that we have not one, not two, but 3 24-hour live streams. So there's Starbase Live, which, as the name implies, covers everything that's going on at Starbase. So we have cameras on the production site and on the suborbital launch pads and on the orbital launch pad. Then we also have McGregor Live, which covers all of the engine testing that SpaceX does in McGregor. And we have Space Coast Live, that covers everything at the Space Coast. So if you're interested in any of that, nsf.live.
And all of those live cameras come from the support that you all provide to the channel. I said you all and not you all because I'm from New England. I can't do the all thing very well, so I just say you all. But Jeff Rowe gifted 1 Red Team membership, and Trey Davis gifted 10 Red Team memberships. So thank you all for growing our community and supporting what we do here at the same time. It is greatly appreciated. So if you're just tuning in, what we are looking at right now is just some activity down at Starbase as we were doing our show. The chopsticks have moved away, so that is an indicator that some progress is going on, or something is about to perhaps be tested in the near future down there. And while we're watching some activity at the orbital launch tower there, we are also keeping an eye on ship 26, which has a crane attached to it. And that ship is going to be eventually lifted onto its test stand for what we presume might be some static fire testing, although we're not sure if they're going to do that while the other rocket, which is destined for space, is sitting waiting for a few pad-related areas to get wrapped up, along with some of the FAA regulatory issues as well. And maybe we should just go back to where we were at the beginning of the show, gentlemen. Maybe Trevor or Ryan, just a quick recap of some of the activity that you all think, again, you all think might kind of delay things a bit beyond the FAA.
Sure. So we've seen some work being done on the GSE at the pad. So we've seen the piping underneath the 3 large horizontal water tanks have been removed. Unfortunately, we don't have any footage of that to show. But that is a good indicator that they're at least not fully ready for launch, and we're not sure if they're hooking up the 4th tank that they got, or if they just have to do some maintenance work. And also, as we were saying earlier, this is something that we think that they could install again rather quickly, but still something that is not there right now that they would need for a launch attempt. And then we also saw the CO2 storage tank has been removed, and we have footage of it rolling by Roberts Road. I'm not sure if Kevin will be able to pull that up. And what we think the CO2 is for the booster now, and on ship actually, right? They replaced the 2 small chines with 2 large chines and installed these really, really long tanks under it. And we think that those are filled with carbon dioxide, CO2, and are used to purge the engine sections during flight. And what this was do is, as we saw on the first flight, the engines were leaking CH4 and oxygen, and then lighting on fire and shutting down prematurely. So SpaceX has really gone all out on this on Booster 9 and are trying to remove that. So they basically installed fire extinguishers on the booster. So it has its own fire extinguishers now to purge the engine section both on the booster, and we believe that's on the ship. So that's what the new vents at the bottom of the booster are for, and the CO2 tanks to fill those up have been removed. And then also, as we've been talking about a little bit, it definitely seems like SpaceX is preparing to either do a full stack cryo test or a wet dress rehearsal with the vehicle.
And what's the difference, by the way, between a full stack cryo test versus a wet dress rehearsal?
Yeah, really good question. So wet dress rehearsal is they are pretending that they're in a launch countdown, then they stop at vehicle ignition. So they're going to load liquid oxygen and CH4 onto the vehicle. They're going to load the CO2, all of the COPVs and all of that, and then run the launch countdown just like they're about to launch up until engine ignition, and then obviously not ignite the engines. When a full stack cryo test is they're just loading liquid nitrogen onto the entire vehicle. So wet dress rehearsal gets you more data, but it's also a riskier test since you're loading a bunch of CH4 onto the vehicle. So if they do a full stacked wet dress rehearsal, we'll see that SpaceX will have to evacuate the village. When if they do a cryo test, they can do that without evacuating the village.
So that's maybe something that they can do in the interim here that wouldn't be as disruptive to all the residents that live there. How many people are still there? Because I know a lot of people moved out. I did see a video of somebody who decided to stick around in their home, and it rattled everything, including the windows. But is it still pretty active with residents there?
We have our own Mary, who is still a resident of the village. So, you'll see her on Twitter, Boca Chica Gal. But SpaceX did offer all of the residents something like 2-3x market, what the market was saying for their houses, and many people did take them up on that offer. So I believe it's also used whether, I'm not sure if it's permanent or temporary, but I believe that residents can also use the village.
And that sound you hear in the background is the sounds from Starbase of all the venting and other things that are going on down there. And it's not just rocket activity. They have venting on a regular basis, right, gentlemen?
Mm-hmm.
Tanks evening out their pressure and everything else. So, we were talking a little bit about some of the changes that have happened to Starship, the hot staging ring, for example. Check 2 here with a $5 super chat. Brings up a good question. If we see another example of some of the changes that have happened as a result of that first launch and the lessons learned, who says here, if we see a successful hot stage ring separation, we will also see a new test to the electric gimbal actuators for the Raptor engines. And that too is a new item on Starship. So I don't know if Trevor, you can hit that one and tell us about that. Or maybe Ryan knows.
Yeah,
I know there was some changes to that.
Sorry, the question went in one ear and out the other. Yes, okay. Booster 9 has the electric gimbaling, and the Ship 25 does not. So, yeah, the next ship will have testing with electric TVC, since Ship 26 and later does have ETVC. I'm not sure.
How were they gimbaling before they put this electric system in?
Yeah, they were hydraulic powered. So there was hydraulic pressure units on both the booster and on the ship that would move the engines around. But I don't see the relation to the hot staging ring that they're asking about.
So it's not related there. But I would imagine, though, if you had these hydraulic gimbaling mechanisms on the engines, that's a pretty significant failure point, especially if something happened to the hydraulic lines going to those gimbal motors, mm-hmm. right, Brian?
Mm-hmm. And if we see a loss of hydraulic power unit on a booster, like we probably saw with the first integrated flight test, then obviously you have a leak in that hydraulic line. It doesn't work as hydraulics anymore. You need a hydraulic system to be pressurized. So, also, if you have a hydraulic power unit blow up, let's say, it scatters debris in the trail of the engines, and you don't want your engines to fail. So, it's by minimizing moving parts, such as hydraulics, you minimize the chance that something can go wrong.
And if you... Oh, the chopsticks are going back up now. What's going on? We're going to go back to our cameras in Texas. So it looks like, are they moving them back into position?
It looks like they're also closing.
Mm-hmm. So that may have just been see if they can actually spread them out to their maximum gimbal point and then bring them back together, perhaps in preparation for a wet dress rehearsal, just to make sure that the chopsticks will operate in that way as necessary for that test.
And if you are just tuning in, we are doing our regular show called Countdown to Launch, where we look at all of the developments going on with Starship. And we had a couple of topics that we talked about that occurred since the last time we did one of these shows, which was yesterday. And we were speculating about the FAA licensing issues going on and whether or not that's the holdup, along with looking at a few of the other pad issues that SpaceX has been working here as they ready this rather large stack of rocket to go into its first orbital test. And we also talked about Ship 26 being rolled out and will be potentially lifted up onto its test stand. So that was our show for today, but we've actually extended the show a bit because we're seeing some activity down there, namely the Chopsticks opening and now basically going back in on that orbital stack. We wanted to keep an eye on things with our experts on the call here so we can see what's going on. We do have 24/7 coverage of everything going on at the SpaceX Texas facilities, both of them. But it's always great when we've got our experts on the call here to be able to look at this and share with viewers what we're observing as things are happening there. So it looks like one Chopstick is back in position, but the other one is not, right?
I think
it's a little, it's a little lopsided. Yeah, because it's the chopsticks aren't parallel to the tower. They can spread out wide, and then they can also swivel whilst keeping the angle relative to the other chopstick the same. They can turn as like a single unit. So that's also something that can, it looks a little bit deceptive sometimes if you're looking at a particular angle. But you can see from this perspective here, you're kind of looking dead on with the chopsticks there, and you can see that they are still even pretty much on both sides as they come in.
So I bet you somebody at SpaceX was watching when we said, "Hey, why don't you lift that rocket up?" And they said, "Well, we can't do that, but we'll give you some chopstick movement here." So that's we should take credit for this, because it happened while we were live. So, but we'll keep an eye on things and see if anything else is happening there. And while we keep an eye on things, we do have some more Red Team membership gifts coming in. So Tracy here gifted a Red Team membership to another member of our community. Super Steph, I believe she did some earlier, just did 10 more. So thank you very much for helping to add members to our great community here. And Apocalypse Cow also gifted 10 Red Team memberships. And would anybody like to comment on what you get with a membership, in case people are curious?
You get
what
photos.
Don't you get?
Don't you get? Right.
What don't you get? So for the different levels, you get different access things. So you get photos from the photographers. For example, if you're Capcom, you get access to our Discord server. You can see Jack doing all sorts of random stuff that he decides to do down there in the Discord. A very fun place to hang out. If you like talking about things, not only space things, but if you like talking about things within the community, Discord is the best place to do that. And then, of course, launch director, flight engineer members. You just get, it's a significant amount of contribution which goes directly into supporting the operations here. So, not only do you get to feel good for helping, you get lots of photos and videos, and you also get access to the Discord. So, plenty of cool perks there.
Yeah, there are some awesome people in the Discord. Like if you're a big Kerbal Space Program player, we have a member, Moldy Space Industries, who will make your eyes bleed with the horribleness that they create. And same with a bunch of other members. So, yeah, awesome place. You should check it out.
It's a great way to connect with the community here. All right, the chopsticks are going back to where we saw them earlier. So it looks like, if you thought that maybe they're going to try to sneak a launch out of here, it looks like that's not happening with those chopsticks going back in. And do you think when they put those chopsticks back in, will the weight of the rocket kind of be resting on them, or they're just going to be in a position closer to the stack?
They're just closer to the stack. They shouldn't be weight bearing at all.
Mm-hmm. The only point it should really be carrying that weight is when stacking operations are going on, and of course when the kind of the weight slack, if you were, is being let off from the chopsticks. That's kind of when we heard that not crumbling noise, that kind of metallic noise that we heard during the stacking ops of Ship 25 the other day. So they'll just be next to the ship. There's no point of them hanging out there wide open if they don't need to be. So they'll just keep them as close to the ship as possible.
Right. So we'll keep an eye on that and see if anything else happens on the full stack there. And we have a few new members here. Our discussion about membership led to memberships. So Keith Wokey is a PadRat member, and Trey Davis upgraded to Launch Director. Welcome aboard. Thank you very much for your support. Dinko Stanov became a new member and is a PadRat member, and Trey Davis gifted 5 Red Team memberships. So we're adding a lot to our member drive here today. So thank you all for your support of NSF. So we are just kind of waiting things out here. I'll take a question from Julian, because I think this does speak to the timeline that we were talking about earlier. So what our earlier discussion was about was in regards to whether it's the FAA holding things up, whether there's some issues between SpaceX and the FAA. Julian wants to know, has SpaceX completed the mishap investigation? As far as we know, they have. They submitted a report. Unfortunately, though, these are confidential documents for a number of reasons. You have trade secret issues, of course, but you also have ITAR restrictions on technology going out of the country. So unfortunately, we don't get to see everything that's in there. We can kind of hear about some of the changes that are being made. Trevor, certainly some of the changes on the pad and the rocket are probably the result of the findings of that report, right?
Yeah, so to be a little pedantic here, I believe the mishap investigation report is handled by the FAA and not SpaceX. They, of course, work closely with SpaceX, but that's an FAA thing. And then SpaceX, of course, has their own internal data and investigation to figure out what changes they need to make to the booster, what changes they need to make to the ship, and to the GSE. So it seems that SpaceX has submitted all of their findings, and now the FAA is working through them, and SpaceX has submitted what mitigations they have implemented to ensure that, especially the FTS anomaly, doesn't happen again. As usual, as Lon was saying, the FAA doesn't really provide any comment onto how these investigations are going. They will always just issue a blanket statement of the investigation is ongoing. We look forward to telling you more details after it's been completed, or some equivalent statement to that. So we don't have any good indication of how things are going along from the FAA side. Hopefully when we find out, generally Eric Berger or Michael Sheets will find out a few hours before the public, and then they'll tweet about it, and then later the whole report will come out, and then hopefully SpaceX will be cleared to fly. So it's a black box. We don't know how far along that process is.
Right, and everybody seems to be keeping their mouth shut here in regards to the status of that. And that's all we can do is just kind of wait and unfortunately speculate until we know exactly what was the subject of that report. But I think you can look at a lot of the changes SpaceX made to kind of get a hint as to what sorts of things the FAA was looking for, and of course the primary one being the flight termination system actually terminating the flight as they would like it to do. So we'll keep a close eye on that as things continue to develop here. Saris became a new Capcom member. Thank you very much for becoming a Capcom member here at NSF. We appreciate your support greatly. And we're going to keep an eye on things for a few more minutes here as we watch those chopsticks close back. We saw some movement. We wanted to make sure there wasn't something bigger going on here, but it looks like they were just doing some testing. We're seeing that chopstick there on the left kind of moving in a little bit closer. I think that's movement. It's not just atmosphere, right?
It looks like it. These are big enough that hopefully, even though they move slowly, they're big enough that they're bigger than the atmosphere distortion that we see on our cameras. So it's easier to see this move compared to microscopic movements to the ship moving up and down. So it's a little easier to see.
And here's a question from Vulcan 603, because if, let's say, we talked about the over/under on the successful orbit or not. Let's say everything works out as planned. They get this thing into orbit. It goes around once. It gets to Hawaii, and then they go for the splashdown in the ocean. Are they going to try to do a controlled crash, if you will, or a controlled landing onto the water, or are they just going to ditch it? And this is Vulcan 603's question.
Information on that, I don't think, Trevor, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think SpaceX has specifically told us if they're going to try a controlled water landing near Hawaii. I believe the idea is that they're just going to go into the Pacific Ocean and call it a day with the ship.
Yeah, they will not be attempting, if they make it through entry, they will not be attempting to ignite an engine for a soft water landing. They're just going to let it belly flop into the ocean.
And I think that might be mostly because it's easier in terms of like a cleanup process for the ship to be scattered into many parts than the ship to be floating in the Pacific Ocean as a whole ship. Right. Because, remember, this is a massive thing. Let's say if a piece of Starship this big rocks up on the shores of Hawaii compared to a Starship that's 9 meters wide and 50 meters long rocks up on the shores of Hawaii, right. I'm sure many people would rather to have a piece of Starship that big rock up on the beach than a full vehicle. Because remember, you can be watching this on your phone right now, and it's about that big on your phone. This thing's 120 meters tall. This full stack is 120 meters tall. It's taller than Big Ben. It's taller than the Statue of Liberty. This thing is huge. You don't want something like this rocking up on the beach the next day after it's performed a soft landing in the Pacific.
And that's over 390 feet if you're not up on your metric system. So this is, and it was already the tallest rocket. And then when they added that hot staging ring, it got a little bit taller. So they did have to move, Trevor, they had to move some things around to accommodate that. It's a little bit of a bump in height.
Yeah, so the booster beforehand was approximately 69 meters tall. I think a little over that. And then the ring is 1.8 meters tall. And the hot staging ring is 1 ring height tall, and then second stage is 50 meters tall, so they're right at about 121 meters now, and they were at about 119 before. So they just had to move the ship QD up a little bit, which thankfully seemed pretty easy, and I mean it's in the vehicle right now, so everything looks good, and hopefully they'll validate that with cryo-proof test.
What are we hearing there? That sounds like a vent.
Yeah, venting of some kind. I certainly have no idea where it's coming from with the views that we're looking at right now. But it's not from vehicle, or at least it doesn't sound like it. So, you know, it's
noisy there.
Yeah, there are tons of cryogenics all around the launch site, so venting like this is normal and nominal all the time.
And Andrew R. with the $2 super chat says, "What the Chopsticks doing? What were they doing? They just opened and closed. Like, what do you think the reason was for that?"
Probably a validation test, to be honest. That's all I can think of. Just a quick. Let's stick them out, bring them back in, just make sure that they're working as we expect.
Got it. Well, gentlemen, it looks as though we're kind of back to where we started on the stack, and I believe if we go to our shot of Starship 26, I think it's still sitting there next to the crane, so we may not get the lift we were hoping for today, but this show is going to continue. So not this particular one, but this new show that we're doing called Countdown to Launch. It will be continuing, and the best way to keep up with what we're doing is to, and this is such a cliche thing to say on YouTube, but hit that subscribe button. You can mash it or whatever the term you want to use. I'm not cool, I just say click it. And also ring the bell. We actually have a bell we can ring right now. I think Kevin's got the soundboard, which is normally our fight bell. But ring the bell, and that will give you a notification. There we go.
There you go.
There we go, just like that. Ring the bell because you'll get notified. And typically what we do before we go live with a show like this one, or maybe covering some movement or a launch somewhere in the world, we often schedule those a little bit in advance, so you'll get a notification that, hey, we're about to go live, and you'll have time to come in. And what's great is that, what's so awesome about this community is that even when we schedule a live, there's usually a couple hundred people that just flood in just to start talking about what's going on. And we were certainly keeping an eye on the chat as we were getting the show ready for today. So those are some great ways that you can follow what we are doing here. And it looks as though most of the activity we were extending the show for here at Starbase has kind of ceased. So I will turn it over to Trevor and then to Ryan for some final parting thoughts here on what you think we might be talking about on the next show.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully by the next show, we have a little bit clearer of an idea of what SpaceX's plan is going forward, both with Ship 26 and with the full stack. I suspect, just TLDR of the episode, that launch is probably 2 to 3 weeks out, if not maybe even a little bit more. And no idea what they're doing with Ship 26. It could just be a backup if this next flight doesn't go very well, that they will fly it. And despite what Elon says, it certainly seems like they're not quite ready to fly. They're very close, but as of right now, the FAA is not delaying them too much.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really important point to make, because especially when we see kind of overgeneralized comments saying that it's ready to launch, especially in comment sections around the internet, right? There's people which are like, oh, why is the FAA holding up Starship? They're not. Let's be realistic here. They're not. The water deluge system, as it stands, currently cannot fire because they're working on the plumbing. The FAA need to do their mishap report for safety purposes. There's no point getting angry at anybody, because both sides need to work through all of the different problems between the last launch and the next launch. So when the time comes for everything to be ready to go, that is when they will launch, and neither party is clearly ready to launch. just yet, but fingers crossed it's soon.
All right, and before we wrap up, just remember we've got shop.nasaspaceflight.com where you can get that awesome mission patch for the second flight of this rocket. And because we've got a little bit of time and our shipping is so fast, you can get that patch ready for when it lifts off. And you can have it attached to your flight suit as you watch our coverage of that launch whenever it is. And as we can see here from the extreme close-up of the mission patch, it is fully embroidered, as you can see here. A very high quality patch. You know, I started collecting mission patches of all the different launches that I've seen in person, and it's amazing the quality level difference you get, even on an embroidered patch. So you can see we have, as embroidery goes, this is like the high resolution embroidery. Very fine stitching, as you can see here. So really cool stuff, and if you are a patch collector, this is the patch to get. A bunch of people in the chat got them earlier. You can also leave us a chat message as you purchase them as well. And don't forget that this design from Pauline is also available on mugs and t-shirts and throw pillows. And actually, if you're relaxing on the couch, you can have your coffee or your tea or whatever you like to drink in your cup with the patch. You've got the pillow with the patch, and you've got the patch itself. I mean, what could be better than that? So we are very excited about these, and they are limited in the sense that when we run out of stock, you know, that's pretty much it. So get your patch before the launch so you'll be ready when it does launch. And I want to thank Ryan and Trevor for enduring all of my questions. I know I put people through a lot of interrogations here because I just want to know the answer to these questions, but it's great to have you both on as experts here. And this show will be back, and we will be rotating hosts through as well, so you get to see all of the NSF team in person, face-to-face here. So stay tuned for future episodes. And until then, I am Lon Seidman on behalf of NSF, and we will see you on the next stream. So stay tuned and hit that notification bell.
And here we go. We have liftoff.
Propulsion continues to be nominal.
RCPA chamber pressure looks good.
Rolling up. Roger, Atlantis.
Water towers, fly! Yes! Tango down to nominal.
Flight down to SPD off. Say again, SPD off. Off. It's orange!
Oh my god! Oh my god!
Decollage.
Put that in the big bag, you know.
343 unfolds to go.
Indeed. We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
The methane will be igniting in the flare, correct?
Yikes. You read? We don't need any more of these.